When it comes to procedurally generated 2D dungeon crawlers, we gamers aren't exactly suffering through a drought right now. As a matter of fact, it seems like this genre has usurped this survival game as the easiest thing to find on Steam. So why am I wasting your time by talking about one of these games? Well, Risk of Rain is different from the crowd because, well, okay, so maybe it's not that different. I mean, honestly, at this point, the game is, well, it's an obsession. There, I said it. I'm Jared, and this is Avalanche Reviews. Risk of Rain isn't exactly bursting at the seams with story, so let's let the game tell us its entire narrative. There, did you catch all that? So the story seems to go a little something like this. You and 12 others managed to survive the attacking and subsequent crash of a freighter ship that seems to have been hauling a large cache of weapons and dangerous creatures. You now have to make your way back to the ship's wreckage utilizing weapons and equipment you recover along the way. And that's about it. So as you can see, there isn't exactly a sweeping tale to be told here. As a matter of fact, this game is more interested in getting your attention with its gameplay. Now that being said, this isn't the smallest amount of story I've ever seen in a game, so it gets a pass for at least giving a small but believable setup for the player to get into. Now here's where the real meat and potatoes are. Risk of Rain pulls from a myriad of 2D roguelikes and in my opinion is all the better for it. The basic idea is you choose a survivor and venture out into the hostile planet. The game controls kind of like a platformer and its combat is handled like an action-focused MMORPG. Each shoulder button is given a command and 3 of them require a cooldown before using again. These commands can range anywhere from a projectile attack to a dodge roll or a defensive shield. This all depends on what character you pick and this is where things get nice and deep. Each of the game's 12 characters vary wildly in their playstyles. Some are up-close melee types, while others can be fast shooters or slow-moving tanks. Running through a successful game will be up to your personal playstyle, as the game is balanced around all of these specialities. No matter who you pick though, you will be doing largely the same thing, killing enemies to gain EXP to level up, and money that can be used to open chests with one of over 100 different items. And these items are just about as varied as playable characters. Some will offer huge offensive attacks, while others create defensive buffs or even changes to mechanics like double jumping or the inclusion of a jetpack. At first, these items are generated randomly, but after certain conditions are met, these chests let you choose from an assortment of items. When spawned into an area, the player must look for a teleporter to the next level, which is randomly placed and can be a real pain to find sometimes. Upon activation, the player has to survive 90 seconds of a much increased enemy spawn rate and that area's boss. Either after time is up or all enemies have been killed, you can proceed to the next area and do it all again. The wildly varied ways to play the game and random nature of these essential items are definitely a selling point, but they pale in comparison to the genius that is a difficulty level that scales with time. Since it's possible to spend all your time leveling up and finding rare items, the developers included a system that radically increased enemy levels and spawn rates with increments of time. This makes the first 30 minutes of a new game a mad dash to find a teleporter, since you won't be equipped to handle how hard the game can get if you mess up by even a couple of minutes. As time goes on, the game gets sadistically difficult, but on a lucky run, this can be a very good thing. When you finally get to the last level, you're given the option to either proceed to the last area or run through the levels again. Choosing the latter will result in an even more ridiculous increase in difficulty, and at this point you will likely have a hard time even distinguishing your character from the massive amounts of enemies and visual indicators showing you what buffs are active and what items you've obtained. And this is when you start to slip into a trance-like state, and suddenly you've been playing for hours without noticing. It seems like starting a new game is about as random as the mechanics. Sometimes I find myself dying within the first 10 minutes, and other times I'll have 3 or 4 hours under my belt without knowing where all the time went. I can say without a doubt that Risk of Rain is one of the most addicting experiences I have ever had in a game. Its controls are well implemented, and its mechanics are finely tuned to keep you invested for as long as you possibly can. This is definitely one of those experiences that has your brain talking you into that just one more level kind of mentality. So if you're into procedurally generated roguelikes or twitchy high difficulty action games, it's a good bet that Risk of Rain is going to become your new obsession. When I say independently developed PC game, there's a pretty good chance all of you just imagined a 2D pixel-based game, and for good reason. This style is synonymous with the indie game scene, and a retro game lover like myself couldn't be happier with that. Risk of Rain is of course one of about a million other games to jump on this bandwagon, but it still manages to stand out. The best word I can think of to describe the design for this game's sprite work is minimalist. Every enemy and character is made up of a very small number of tiny pixels, and it can be hard to make out a lot of small details without squinting and getting close to your monitor. That being said, the actual design of each sprite is unique and recognizable, which really helps in the latter parts of the game, as enemies tend to travel in huge groups. The animations for each sprite are beautifully fluid, and every character I've played with has felt and moved in their own unique way. Special moves and normal attacks all have several more frames of animation than you would expect for a sprite-based game, and this helps give Risk of Rain its own little charm. Now right smack dab in the middle of that charm is how absolutely chaotic things can get on screen. After 60 or so minutes of gameplay, your screen will likely be filled with huge amounts of enemies, all of your accumulated upgrades and buffs, explosions and projectiles from your own attacks, and more than a couple of the game's boss monsters. Now typically I'd be damning the game for being so cluttered, but since you have to work your ass off to get to this point, it feels more like a visual show of all my in-game progress. As far as 2D sprite-based games go, I tend to prefer a more SNES and Genesis era look, but Risk of Rain's unique design, smooth animations, and wealth of effects has worked its way right into my heart. As far as a 2D sprite-based roguelike, Risk of Rain has some heavy competition in the indie scene, but the question is, does this game live up to the greats that occupy its genre? Let's take a look at the pros and cons to find out. Gameplay in Risk of Rain starts off slow, but eventually gets so fast and twitchy that keeping up with it becomes a personal achievement. Essentially, ROR's difficulty is up to the player. How long you play dictates how hard the game is, and after the last level you can choose to go through the game again, but with harder monsters and more bosses. These options are always available, and this means an almost infinite amount of challenge. No matter what your playstyle is, there is a character for you. From up-close melee fanatics to sharpshooting snipers, there are enough taste on display here that your fancy is bound to be represented. Even if you're used to rock-solid challenges, a couple times around with Risk of Rain is liable to tap into that primal anger part of your brain. If you're like me, you get a lot of your gaming in at night after work, and the long hours I've put into this game have led to many a tired, regret-filled mornings. While I like the idea that my screen was often filled with almost unidentifiable pixels and shapes, some may not see that as a positive. Well guys, ultimately it's up to you to decide if this latest offering deserves the honor of being held up to games like Rogue Legacy. Now if you ask me, Risk of Rain is definitely worthy of its small price tag on Steam. Its gameplay will draw you in slowly, but after a while you'll look up and 3 hours have blown by. With games like this, story's often thrown by the wayside, and a staunch supporter of narrative-based games like myself was weary of such an idea at first. But I can say that 60 or so hours later, I am a believer, and Risk of Rain gets a huge recommendation from me. And that's about it for me, but I will be back soon, so until next time, I'm Jared. And this has been Avalanche Reviews.